This notion that African Americans don't have culture and are lacking in identity is pervasive. In fact, I'll keep it a buck and admit that I once felt this way. I believe we are a watered-down version of Africans. I was envious of Afro-Cubanos and Brasileños that seemed to maintain more of our African culture. Of all the Africans stolen and brought to the Americas, it seemed that we had the least connection to our motherland. Hi, welcome to Blaxit to Africa. I'm Tadre Delora Moignet, a California native living my best life in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you for coming along for the ride. I hope that you are informed, entertained, and inspired to Blaxit to Africa. On this episode of Blaxit to Africa, I am discussing African Americans and the misguided notion that we don't have a culture or an identity. Let me begin by saying that African Americans, like other Africans in the diaspora and on the continent, have our own uniquely gorgeous culture. The consumption of our culture for global use is a testament to our brilliance, cultural influence, and importance in the world. It is a reflection of the deep impact that we have had on music, fashion, art, and many other aspects of global culture. So last week, I was triggered by FNS Uncensored, hosted by Feyikemi Akinbankole and Simi Badiru. On the episode, It's Not Right, the two women discuss current events in Nigeria and the United States. In regards to American current events, they specifically discuss African American culture events and media. I enjoyed hearing their perspective and learning about important issues affecting Nigerians and consequently the world. They mentioned the American series Swarm. According to 17 magazine, Swarm is a new hit series on Prime Video that has social media buzzing. In Swarm, Donald Glover and Janine Neighbors deliver a frightening examination of stan culture through a suspenseful tale about an obsessed fan and the extreme lengths she is willing to go to, all in the name of her favorite pop star. It features Dominique Fishback, Chloe Bailey, Damson Idris, and more. The two podcast hosts state, this is probably a true story. African Americans, God forgive me because I'm always coming for them, but they are the type. They are not okay. Their lack of identity. When they stated that African Americans lack identity and as a result are prone to do fucked up shit, I was triggered. And at that moment, everything they stated subsequently, I took with a grain of salt. This is not a podcast that I follow, nor do I wish to publicly shame them. It is a podcast that popped up on my Spotify feed. I love podcasts, I host a podcast, and I frequent women-hosted podcasts as well as music from Africa. So I thought, this is Nigeria, they're women. Okay, let's see what these young women have to say. That's how I stay current, by listening to other perspectives and music. I guess that's why it was recommended to me. This Nigerian podcast seems to be very popular. They have a 4.9 star rating and are highly recommended as far as African podcasts go. This is the only episode that I've listened to, but here we can see that she often comes for African Americans. I get that all media is subjective and everyone is entitled to their opinion, and yet we are all responsible for the words that come out of our mouths, and we will face repercussions, retaliations, or blessings, either energetically or physically. This notion that African Americans don't have culture and are lacking in identity is pervasive. In fact, I'll keep it a buck and admit that I once felt this way. I believe we are a watered-down version of Africans. I was envious of Afro-Cubanos and Brasileños that seemed to maintain more of our African culture. Of all the Africans stolen and brought to the Americas, it seemed that we had the least connection to our motherland. As a result of this feeling of lack, I purposely learned as much as I could. I minored in African studies during undergrad. I studied Chichewa, one of the 2 official languages of Malawi. At one point, before I came to understand American foreign policy, I strove to be an ambassador to an African nation. I studied in Africa, worked in Africa, and advocated for Africa, all because of my love and strong connection I felt for Africa. I'm a bit ashamed to say that it wasn't until I moved to Zanzibar, Tanzania in January 2018 that I realized we are African in the truest sense, while simultaneously creating our own culture. There are many people who feel and have said such openly in public and private spaces. Some Africans in the U.S. are adamant about their children not marrying African Americans because of this notion that we don't have culture, are lacking in identity, and don't make good spouses. All the while, they consume our culture with voracity and stand on the shoulders of African Americans who bled, sweat, and toiled for the right to be a full human in the United States. I actually ended a serious relationship with a West African man raised in the U.S. because he refused to acknowledge the sacrifices and trails his family blazed as a result of African American activism and perseverance. Pharrell Williams has stated, "The world is fascinated with our culture, but they fail to realize that without us, that culture wouldn't exist. Whenever we do something, people want to adopt it, but I don't think they are looking at the whole picture. I feel like the people who are making the decisions to take from Black culture don't really know the culture. They just want to be part of the trend." There is this cognitive dissonance that happens to people while they consume our culture with a voracious appetite, all the while condemning African Americans and claiming that we don't have culture. I don't want to drag these young women because they are learning and growing just like myself. However, I will use their podcast as an example. They devoted a considerable amount of time focusing on media performed by African Americans and yet claim that we lack identity. Our identity is our culture. Our accomplishments and art is not separate of our culture. Identity and culture are deeply interconnected, as culture plays a significant role in shaping individual identity. Culture includes shared beliefs, values, practices, and customs that define a group of people, and individuals often adopt aspects of their cultural identity as part of their personal identity. Since moving to Africa, I see men wearing sagging, skinny jeans, baseball caps turned backwards, and popular African American haircuts. I see women dressing like their favorite influencers and celebs who often self-identify as African American. Even when they mimic African celebs, these personalities often mimic African American media personalities. African colloquialisms are a mixture of local slang peppered with AAVE, period. Okay, boo, that slaps. All of which is us. Africans have a difficult time wrapping their minds around the fact that African Americans are a numerical minority in the U.S. due to the prevalence of African American TV shows, movies, and music occupying African radio waves, small and big screens. America is a great country, and the thing that makes it great is our culture, our music, our movies, our style. And it just so happens that African American culture has been a huge part of that culture, probably the biggest part if you really think about it. That's a quote from Jay-Z. And even while African American vernacular English is dripping from African lips and our swag is hanging from their bodies, eyes and ears tuned to our performances, some Africans still have the audacity to fix their lips and say that Black folk don't have culture. Unpack that for yourselves. Culture is a broad term used to describe the shared values, beliefs, behaviors, customs, traditions, and artifacts that characterize a group or society. It encompasses the way of life and worldview of a particular group of people, including their religion, language, arts, music, food, clothing, and other aspects of their daily life. Culture is learned and transmitted from one generation to the next through various forms of socialization, including family, schools, religious institutions, and the media. It shapes how people perceive and interact with the world around them and provides a sense of identity and belonging for members of a particular group. Now, African American culture is some of what you see and so much more. It can be a slippery slope because while the performers are black, they are controlled by white entities, from Beyonce to LeBron James. LeBron James can't play basketball professionally without a contract from the NBA or the like. Beyonce cannot generate the same numbers without music distributors controlled by a board of non-white people. So when you consume African American culture, beware. It is often an exaggeration of some perverted and stereotypical notion of black people. To know us, you gotta know us, and I realize this is much easier said than done. One of my closest friends is Ugandan. She is a well-traveled professional woman and a self-proclaimed Pan-African. One of the first things she said to me was, "You're the first African American I've met." In my head, I'm like, damn, I gotta make a good impression. If you have time, read our books, listen to our podcasts, and watch our videos on YouTube. You'll find that we are not a monolith. I'll never forget how I hosted a Juneteenth event at my home in Kenya. Juneteenth is an annual holiday celebrated on June 19th in the U.S. that commemorates the end of slavery. In June 19th, 1865, when General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced that all enslaved people in Texas were free, over 2 years after most enslaved people were freed in the United States. Juneteenth is now recognized as a day of reflection, education, and celebration of African American culture and heritage. It is recognized as a national holiday. So at this party, there were African Americans and Kenyans. Many of the Kenyans had grown up in the U.S., been educated there, raised their families there, and were now back in Kenya. So we played this game called Black Card Revoked, in which a series of African American cultural questions were asked. If you couldn't answer correctly, your cards were taken. Black Card Revoked is a reference when a Black American behaves in a way that is not typically Black or betrays our community. We'll say, "You lost your Black card." As in, we oust you from the community and you are no longer Black. One question was, if a matriarch in your family calls to tell you that she has dreamt about fish, what does that mean? The answer is that somebody is pregnant and she is calling you. That means that you're the one that's probably pregnant. I used to hate those calls. So all the African Americans knew the answer 100%. My Kenyan friends did not and were shocked at how little they knew despite having spent so much time in the U.S. and even being partnered with African Americans. They didn't realize we had so much culture and tradition. I say all this to say that we have our own culture and it's deeper than one can see. We are African American and yet we are African in the most insidious of ways. I am increasingly discovering just how African we are without even knowing it. Our grandmothers did not claim Africa, but they went to church every Sunday trying to outdo each other with the brightest and largest hats. That's Africa. Our worshiping style of clapping hands, getting the Holy Ghost, active listening, and speaking in tongues is Africa. Am I to say that because Africans of the Anglican tradition don't do these things, they must not be real Africans? I attended an Anglican service in Okongo, Namibia. I swear it was the most boring church service I ever attended. Am I to say that the Ovambo in attendance are not African because they worship in quiet? We eat sweet potatoes with butter and brown sugar and call them baked yams. In longing for African yams, newly arrived Africans in the Americas gladly accepted sweet potatoes from indigenous Americans, then added butter and brown sugar according to the preferences of the white people they served. But what's so interesting to me about this dialogue, about this criticism, is that it always seems to be about African Americans. Is it because we are at the forefront? Because I ain't never heard no one say that Afro-Brazilians or Afro-Cubans had no culture or identity. Our primary differences are tied to the mofos that kidnapped us, whether we speak English or Spanish or Portuguese. We are all a blend. We are all descended from Africa and all brought to the Americas. Of course, we are different, and that's cool. It's the spice of life that we love. But just as you think Afro-Brasileiros, Cubanos, and Jamaicans have their own culture with their own identity, you should regard us in the same way. So what is African culture? Is it the Maasai that are heavily marketed to the West? Is it patriarchy and abuse of women? Is it corruption? Because these are the issues that are often accompanied with Africa in U.S. media. I would be wrong if I believed everything I read or heard. Within the Bugandan culture of Uganda, the gomesi is worn by brides for traditional weddings. Legend has it that the gomesi was created by a Portuguese tailor. The origins of the gomesi are unclear. It is a floor-length dress made of brightly colored fabric with a square neckline and short, pointed sleeves, and yards of fabric that the bride releases on her wedding night to keep her and her man warm like a blanket. The history of the gomesi can be traced back to the late 19th century when Christian missionaries introduced Western-style clothing to Uganda. At the time, the gomesi was considered a more modest alternative to traditional skins and bark cloth. On his wedding day, the groom wears a sports jacket, which is British, over a kanzu, which is Arabic. Now, when it comes to the white wedding, the bride wears a large poofy white dress, and the groom may wear a tuxedo or what you might find a Nigerian groom wearing. Based on this fact, am I to deny Bugandan culture? Am I to say that their culture is watered down or doesn't exist? Hell no. In this day and age, where we can be transported across the globe within seconds via our pocket computers, we are influenced by each other, whether we like it or not. A tradition may have originated in one place, but in the end, we make it our own, though sometimes we copy and paste. I recall voicing to my videographer that I was disappointed that East African music videos mimicked 90s American rap videos. I expected better. I expected more. I wanted to see originality, not just the same dude posturing, liquor being showered on women, scantily clad vixens and dancers gyrating and twerking on a man she wouldn't ordinarily look twice at. There are African artists doing their own thing, of course, but you get my point. There is really so much to say about this subject. American pop culture is Black culture. Where do I begin? Matter of fact, listen to episode 3, The Birth of American Music, on the 1619 podcast. Nicole Hannah-Jones and New York Times critic Wesley Morris can break it down better than I can. In that episode, host Nicole Hannah-Jones explores the roots of American music and its ties to African traditions. American pop music has deep roots in African American culture, which can be traced back to the earliest days of American music. The enslaved Africans brought with them their rich musical traditions, which were centered around communal singing, percussion instruments, and call and response patterns. These traditions were blended with European musical traditions, and over time, new forms of music emerged that reflected the unique cultural and historical experiences of African Americans. One of the most important contributions of African American music to American pop music is the blues. The blues emerged in the late 19th century as a fusion of African and European musical traditions, and it quickly became a popular form of music in African American communities across the United States. The blues served as a foundation for many other forms of American music, including jazz, rock and roll, and hip hop, all of which is consumed by the world. Y'all better ask somebody. Despite the appropriation and exploitation of African American musical traditions by white performers, African Americans continue to be at the forefront of American popular music. African American musicians such as Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, and Duke Ellington played a pivotal role in the development of jazz, blues, and other forms of American music. And our contributions helped to shape the sound and feel of American popular music as we know it today. And it's not just our music. Our influence extends beyond syncopation. Y'all remember when black TikTokers went on strike? They was tired of creating viral videos only to have white TikTokers reap the benefits. The moment I stopped code switching was the moment I realized that the black slang my white colleagues used in the office got them a chuckle and a pat on the back. But when I used the same language, I was deemed ghetto and inappropriate. Everything from our street fashion to our food is mimicked and bastardized. So what is identity? In sociology, identity refers to the various characteristics, beliefs, values, and behaviors that define an individual or a group and distinguish them from others. It is a complex and multidimensional concept that can be shaped by a range of factors such as social class, race, gender, religion, and culture. Identity can be seen as both a personal and a social construct, as it is influenced by both individual experiences and social structures. Individuals develop their sense of identity through interactions with others and their environment, as well as through their own internal processes of self-reflection and self-awareness. Moreover, identity is not fixed or static, but is subject to change over time and in different contexts. As individuals move through different stages of life and encounter different social situations, their sense of identity can shift and evolve. Now, when I was a young college student, I defined myself as Malcolm X did, as an African born in America. When I studied at the University of Ghana, I began to realize just how American I really was. Americans are defined by many things, one of them being convenience. Not having the lights turned on whenever I flip the switch or not being able to indulge in around-the-clock access to products and services reminded me just how American I was. In some circles, I'm a Cali girl. In others, I'm a big city girl with Midwestern values because I was born in Indiana and lived there until the age of 2. I can attend a West African meetup in Kenya and claim Cameroon and Sierra Leone just as much as a first-generation African American because I am descendant of the Mafa and Mende people. My tribe is African American. My nationality is American. Because identity is fluid, this will change. The reason why there is a black expat in Kenya or Ghana and South Africa group is because we share the same identity. There is no confusion. Most of us miss eating grits, grew up on jazz, and share idioms like a hit dog will holler. Most of us desire a black partner because we have a shared identity. Now, there are some nuances. Some folks like sugar with their grits, though I don't get that, while most of us like salt, black pepper, and butter. At the end of the day, we eat grits. Grits are rooted in Africa due to its similarity to ugali, posho, kenkey, and its other African iterations. African Americans are a genetic and cultural blend, usually of African, European, and Indigenous American ancestry. Despite forced assimilation due to American apartheid, we held on to our African culture via our colorful and unique style, cuisine, call and response music, spirituality, ways of greeting, etc. I hope I have made myself clear. I hope that when you hear someone, including an African American, stating that we lack culture and identity, that you check them with love and patience. Better yet, send them on over here. Send them to Blaxit to Africa. That's it for today. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Blaxit to Africa. If you liked what you heard, please share and leave a review. May you thrive. May you be inspired. May you move with love and intention. Until next time.